I'm not interested at all, Lex, in compounds or psychedelics. I mean, I love drugs, but what interests me and compels me is space.
This is our humble hemp patch.
5,000 years of medical cannabis use.
We're learning about other cannabinoids.
Marijuana is grown in every state in the Union.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. Addiction isn't simply an illness that you catch and then you cure. It's a dynamic and meaningful state. And Dimitri Mugianis has spent his life making spaces where people can learn and engage in their own self-recovery. For one, he's administered hundreds of underground Iboga treatments, has dedicated himself to helping others through his work in harm reduction, and he's also changed my life by introducing me to the 12 Steps program. But while Iboga, a molecule from the Iboga root of Africa, helped Dimitri with his opioid and stimulant addiction, he doesn't advocate it as an automatic cure. He wants people to find the meaning behind their addictions, without getting caught up in trendy drug regimens or in blindly trusting therapists. Especially not in blindly trusting therapists. As you'll be able to tell, he's an old friend, and he's the kind of guy where the stories he's forgotten are more interesting than most of us will ever experience. He started a band as a teenager in New York called Leisure Class. That music brought him to New York City, where he started to pal around with the old beats like Gregory Corso and Herbert Huncke. He shot dope with some of the greats. But after hitting rock bottom, he traveled to the Netherlands for a treatment with Iboga, and eventually made the trip to Gabon to be initiated into the spiritual tradition of Bwiti, which you can see in the film about him called I'm Dangerous with Love. Back in the States, he became an underground provider of Iboga. He was friends with the great Howard Lutzoff, the teenage genius and dope fiend who accidentally discovered the ability of Iboga to interrupt the physical dependence of opioids, and who became the prophet to spread the word throughout the world. And now Dimitri's working in harm reduction in Harlem, using a variety of holistic methods at the New York Harm Reduction Educators, a great organization to donate to. He's also helping people with legal treatments outside the country using MDMA and psilocybin, and he's working on his memoir, which I'm more excited for than pretty much anything else I know that's being written right now. Today, you'll hear why he doesn't advocate for Iboga like he once did, his strong critiques of the so-called Psychedelic Renaissance, and his passion for the beautiful anarchy of the 12 Steps and the 12 Traditions. This is an enriching talk with a unique and passionate thinker who's seen it all and came here to share it. So please enjoy this conversation with Dimitri Mugianis. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with Dimitri Mugianis. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Lex.
So to start, because you're such a good person to ask on this, what is Iboga and why has it become such a topic of interest in these last few decades?
So Iboga is a plant grown in West Equatorial Africa, primarily and most abundantly in Gabon. So if you sort of take your finger along the equator on the globe, and you'll come right to Gabon. It is a shrub that produces these beautiful orange fruits that are not very tasty, but pretty, not awful either, but that's not what we're talking about. The thing that what draws the interest is the root. The second layer of the root bark, which is used as a sacrament in the tradition of Bwiti, which is the religion or spirituality that grew up around the ingestion of it, Iboga being the central sacrament. It is a psychedelic. It produces visions. It has been used for initiation in Bwiti, and much like ayahuasca or peyote, it is the essential sacrament which several different traditions, depending on the ethnic group of Bwiti, have grown around the ingestion of it. And then it also has to do, the Bwiti has to do with also the pharmacopoeia of the forest, which is, Gabon is in incredibly dense and diverse rainforest, and music and the performing arts is healing arts. So Iboga is used in Gabon as for initiatory purposes, also for healing purposes. But the way it sort of announced itself to the West, this second layer of the root bark of the Iboga bush, is that it interrupts physical dependency on opiates and opioids with little or no withdrawal. That's how I came across it 18 years ago. I was a 20 plus year heroin, cocaine, and methadone user. And in one treatment, I interrupted my dependency and never have it used since. That's not the most. It's about 20% of the folks have had my experience who ingested for addiction. But that's the reason we're talking about it. That's the reason you're talking to me, is that anti-addictive property. Now, I should say, because people ask me all the time, it's not the only thing Iboga does. It's not its primary or traditional use. If we want to have a creation story or of its arrival in the States, I don't know, creation story, let's say a beginning story of its arrival in the States, I would say Iboga announced itself into to the world by the very politicized body of the American junkie, and by doing such a remarkable turnaround for so many people's lives, that story, that narrative of being a heroin addict on Monday and then 3 days later after the very difficult experience with Iboga not being one is the reason we know about it. But folks in the West have come to it for spiritual reasons, for other healing reasons. It is a remarkable plant. It's also very high threshold in terms of preparation and safety protocol. It's cardiotoxic. It lasts several days. So it's a really interesting plant that that was instrumental in my recovery and in the recovery of thousands of other people.
And how would you describe the experience? It's typically called a 3-day trip, but you say that's in some ways not really accurate.
Yeah, I mean, it's, the problem with, as we get into the continued acceptance of psychedelics, there's not a revival or I mean, psychedelics have always been around. It's just that, I mean, an old white guy took 5 drugs and there's a psychedelic, wrote a book about it, and there's a psychedelic revival. Okay, I digress. But how would I describe it? So, like, what I was getting to is the problem of trying to put all this depends on biology and biography of the individual coming to any psychedelic, right? So there are folks that 3-day trip, yeah, that happens. There are folks that do trip for 3 days. There's sort of on both ends of the scale. There are people who take Iboga and feel nothing but nausea. That happens. And Ibogaine as well, the hydrochloride, which we use in the States and in Europe and Mexico and South America for detox. People, either one, Ibogaine or Iboga, people on one side feel absolutely nothing, maybe 2%. On the other side, I've seen maybe 2%, 1% people trip for an entire week, deep into a trip. But the reason that we say that 3-day trip is because you're on your ass. It really sort of lays you down, and there are folks who need that much time to sort of move. So I would say the actual tripping part is more like 8 to 12 hours of intensity. And then depending on the individual, and that could go much longer, as I've said, but depending on the individual, there is a long period of reflection and rest. They after the first 24 hours in the West, they call the second day the gray day. You might even be really sad the second day. A lot of folks are, but you sort of go through this gray, period, the sort of foggy period for about a day or so, and then you slowly get your strength back. It's not like taking Aya and you're tripping for 4 to 5 hours, and then everyone's up having a bowl of fruit together. It's not like a mushroom trip, 4 hours, and then you're out to dinner. This is a long deal. So pack a bag, pack a lunch. You're not going to eat it, you're going to puke it, but pack a lunch. You know what I mean? You got to be there for a minute.
And you hear that it's often very about your biography, your family history, that it is very involved in your life story and the story of your family.
There is an epigenetic quality to it. And again, there's no absolute, you can't say this is going to happen, but that often happens. It happened with me. I've administered it to hundreds of people. I did underground treatments in the States for which I was arrested and prosecuted by the DEA. Just want to give a shout out to the DEA, a little plug. But there's that often. It's also kind of it also seems I'm applying human qualities to it, right? People want to say it's a grandfather, male. I don't fucking know about that. I mean, we need that as a narrative because that's something we can cling on to. I can say this: it seems to be very tricky, and whatever's happening often has a twisted sense of humor. So, I mean, I've been to Gabon and have been initiated and have been back 6 times. I've literally seen Westerners travel all the way to Gabon, and in the pygmy village, they're getting like, Vanna White and Wheel of Fortune. I swear to God, that really happened for 12 hours. So in a lot of ways, it's tricky like that. But getting back to that, there are a lot of reported cases, and myself included, of what was an ancestral narrative and an ancestral healing. And that's what it is used for traditionally. I mean, so much in the Bwiti and even in allopathic medicines, we ask, we go in and they want to know if there's a history of high blood pressure or cancer or addiction or whatever. The doctor's going to ask you that. It's the same thing. I mean, they're looking for what pattern brought you to the where you are right now. They view it as an ancestral spell. And it seems to work incredibly. It often, not always, the precision is just insane. The meaning that you go in with this one ancestral, this family issue, we would call it here. And there seems to be, if not a resolution, and I don't think psychedelics give you resolution, I think they give you perspective. There seems to be a deeper understanding of that. And then what happened with me, and what happens with a lot of folks, there's ancestors that pop up that you never knew about, that were there and guiding you and walking with you. And and the other thing that happens, which happens with other medicines, I've had folks who've had no clue of, other than that it was maybe from Africa. They were coming in to detox from heroin. And this is years ago. This is when we were doing underground treatments, let's say 16, 17 years ago. So it wasn't the YouTube, testimonials and all that. Would describe in detail rituals and traditions from Gabon without any knowledge beforehand. I'm talking about some flaky shit. It interrupts physical dependency of opiates without withdrawal. Thank you. Next. But yeah.
Well, and that is an amazing part, and it's good that you don't overstate it because you hear about it so much as being this magic pill, and there are no magic pills.
It isn't. And let me just. I'm sorry. I'm going to let you ask a question this time.
No. Why start now? Yeah, I know. I'm interested in the anti-magic pill debate.
Well, I mean, here's the problem with all of this stuff, is that, and this is why I'm no longer an advocate for it. I spent years advocating and working with the late great Howard Lutzoff, who was the one who discovered at 19 as a heroin addict in the Lower East Side. This kid from the Bronx, took Iboga and by sort of happenstance and discovered its anti-addictive properties. His habit was gone. I can go into that at some other point if you'd like. And then, he spent a good part of his life bringing it to the world. And, I am a recipient of Howard's generosity and genius, Howard and Norma Lutzoff and other people, Bob Sisko and Dana Beal and other people in that movement. I'm a recipient of that. But trying to fit this medicine, this drug, into sort of a linear healing paradigm that is not only just coming out of an allopathic tradition, also a shamanistic tradition, by the way. They tend to view things like, as we're going to fix this. as opposed to, a more recovery-based, cyclical, and I mean cyclical in the most positive way, a journey that things change and morph, and you might not get the end result. The problem is when you try to hammer, this idea of cure, 70% reduction in PTSD with MDMA, post-traumatic stress and depression with or a cessation of smoking with mushrooms, or ending a so-called addiction or dependency on opiates with Ibogaine is, first of all, I don't believe it. We could go into peer review and clinical and how they're not objective and they're very political. I don't believe it. I think it's harmful. I understand politically why people would want to, and I'm not saying people who are lying. I think they're really good people doing the research. I think they're really good people working in the field. I'm saying that they are swept up in their own advocacy, like I was swept up. And so what I'm getting to is this, that if we're going to introduce these medicines into like I said, not only an allopathic system of medicine, but also a capitalist system, and the way we're going to study them is through Western reductive science, which is really important and great. And you as a scientist know far better than I do, but it's a beautiful thing about that reduction and trying to find, how things work. And the thing is, it misses the poetry and I like to say that when we're talking about addiction or depression, we need the precision of the inexactitude of poetry, meaning that it's not about stopping fucking using heroin. It's about how we treat each other. And if it was 100% results that everyone stopped using heroin like I did, then that would be great. But that's simply not it. 80% of the people don't, maybe more. And so what are they? They're coming to Iboga or ayahuasca or peyote or MDMA or whatever it is with a serious problem. They've read all the articles, which in some sense is hype. They come with this incredible longing to stop this thing, and then they don't. And I see this with all the other medicines too. And then, so what is wrong with them is the question. Like, it didn't work for me. There's nothing that will work. Instead of looking at it as like, and there's no room for this, by the way, in any of the treatment modalities, whether you're talking about addiction or depression. This is not really a discussed issue in psychedelics. What are we introducing this into? So if we're talking about introducing this into the paradigm of American drug treatment, then we're talking about giving people no room. It's not about actual healing. It's about the economics of insurance, Medicaid, how much the treatment facility, how long you can be there. The reason that there was 28-day treatment for drugs is because that's what insurances will pay for. Now it's gone down to 20 and 16 because of insurance. Insurance dictating that. What I'm saying, what John Lennon said, is giving you no time instead of it all. So these drugs, these so-called medicines, are an opportunity to spend time and give people time and give people care and give people to honor somebody and their journey, and to say that the only outcome is the cessation of drug use or a reduction of so-called PTSD, which is a political diagnosis as well we could get into, but I would go off. And if that doesn't happen, if it doesn't meet the DSM, if it doesn't meet the criterion of you're not using for 6 months or more, then you failed. I think we're not only missing something, we're also shaming people and harming people. And I've seen it done with Ibogaine. What did you ask me?
Who knows?
Though I would like your perspective, though, because whenever we do an episode about this, people are really interested. They're looking for help with problematic drug use.
Yeah.
What would your advice be to someone who heard this and said, "Oh, this could be the thing for me, or my friend, or my relative"? What would you say in terms of warnings and as well as what to look for in the providers they might find either in the underground or at one of those expensive clinics, outside the country?
Well, the first thing is that the expense. It's it's because it's cardiotoxic. Well, the first thing is safety. Let's say that. Let's start with cardiotoxic. Ask a lot of questions if you're going to go to a clinic. Make sure that they have a staff member that are monitoring you at least for 72 hours. It is cardiotoxic, meaning that it does some funky things with the heart, with the resting wave. Do your research about that. Really do a lot of research about counterindications with medication. There are people that die from using Iboga. It's not a huge number, but it's a much bigger number than any other detox. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind that if you're on Subutex, buprenorphine, Suboxone, methadone, that even though I did a detox immediately after methadone, that was 18 years ago, they don't do that any longer. So what you have to do is get on, quote, short-acting opiates, and that means dope or pills. So folks who are in that world know what I'm talking about. And really ask yourself the question, if you are stabilized on maintenance, on methadone maintenance or some sort of form of buprenorphine, is this the right time to go off? And what does your plan look like to go on to this other short acting? The reason you got to go on short acting, I should say for the layperson out there, is those medicines sort of stack up in your liver, stack up in your system. The reason that they're maintenance drugs is because of that. They have a long lasting, long half-life in the body. And that's what makes them good maintenance. What makes it bad for Iboga is that you need to be at least 12 hours into withdrawal before you take the first Iboga, or you're going to have some real trouble. So, it takes weeks and weeks for that to get out of your system. So is it a good time to go on short-acting opiates, i.e. dope or street pills, unless you have a considerate doctor? So that's a question to ask. Is it the right time for you? Is it right for you? And then keep in mind that that it's not for everyone, that nobody has this figured out at all. This thing we call addiction, we don't really have it figured out, except for to say that it is a human condition that needs the type of space and love and attention that all condition needs, all humanity needs. And so if you're looking for a quick fix, and I understand why you would be, this is probably not going to be it. Do you have time afterwards to process this? What are you going to do afterwards? In terms of looking for a place to do it with, do they have that 72 hours of monitoring? Are you looking for a clinical atmosphere? Are you not so much a new agey or a ceremonial person? If you are, then you want a place that's, if your ceremony, because it is a ceremony, is about the doctor's scrubs and and a clean white linen in sort of a hospital setting, then you need to find that sort of ceremonial setting. But if it's around, more of a spiritual space you're looking for, look into that. Make sure those places, actually either one, make sure that they have a medical staff. Do your research, and there's a lot of bullshit out there. So how do you filter through that? I don't know. There's not a lot of underground stuff happening. There still is. I would ask that do they have someone who's a medical professional? Are there more than one person sitting with you? Do they have something to stop and start your heart? If anybody doesn't ask for an EKG and other tests and doesn't give a thorough drilling, then walk away. You want people to ask you as many questions as possible. And then just keep in mind, if it's for your loved ones, that's their journey as much as it's hurting you, perhaps. It's their journey to decide whether to do this or not. I have never seen one person sort of pressured into doing this where there was long lasting, I don't want to use the word success, but someone who's pressured in long-lasting sobriety for someone who was pressured into it. The other thing is expectations. It's maybe 20% walk away and never use again, but try to set your expectations to understand that and to know that if you use again, it's not a failure. You're human. You have this problematic relationship or so-called addiction, however you want to view it, and that is the normal course of things. If you could use this as a time to explore maybe your relationship with the drugs, but also what brought you there. So, I always use the examples early on in my practice. A guy relapsed really soon after, and he was on the street, and he ran out of this. This was years ago. We were doing it in the home of the great Carl Nichols, the late great Carl Nichols, former chairman of the Black Panther Party in New Jersey, had given us his home in Harlem to detox people out of. And anyways, this guy Marcus just ran out at one point. He was just couldn't take it. He was kicking, and he was a guy who worked on the streets, and he did all kinds of things. He was a homeless guy at the time, and Marcus just ran out. He bolted out, and I felt awful. And I remember going looking for him, and I went into Washington Square Park in New York here, and just kind of hanging out there, and because I knew he came through, and he came through, and he was carrying all these CDs that clearly had stolen. He was wearing the same shirt that he had wore like 10 days before. His hair was greasy, and he was clearly using. And when he saw me, he dropped the CDs, threw his arms around me, and said, "Thank you. That changed my life." And what he talked about was that he saw a part of himself he hadn't seen before. He saw himself in a different way, even if he was using. And so who am I to shame somebody? And I understand if you're a family member and the motherfucker just stole your iPhone again, but we should judge people by their actions and not by what's in their body, but there is judgment involved. And if someone steals your iPhone, fuck them. But and they weren't my CDs that Marcus had. But who am I to tell Marcus that wasn't a valuable experience just because we hadn't reached the stated goal? And so that really changed my practice and expanded from Marcus's wisdom. And Marcus OD'd. He died eventually. And I still don't think that was a waste. There was a time where we honored him and we spent time together and we opened up space. I don't like to hold space. I like to co-create space for folks together and allow for a healing that doesn't have to necessarily do with the cessation of symptoms, and more to do with opening that space, because I'm not interested in all Lex and compounds or psychedelics, almost not at all. I mean, I love drugs, but that's not what really interests me and compels me. What interests me and compels me is space. And when we live in a world where they're giving us less and less space, how can we expand that? And how can we open that up? Open sort of the commons, a place where we can gather freely together, and also sort of the commons of the spirit. How can we open that up? How can we explore that? And recontextualizing what healing is. I mean, even if you have the symptoms of PTSD and they continue, they may not even be a pathology if you don't want to walk down a dark alley, if you had a bad experience in a dark alley. It may be just your body telling you that this is what happened. So if that doesn't stop, if the addiction doesn't stop, it doesn't mean that you failed or the process failed. It just means that your body and something in you is holding on to that, and probably for very good reason. I mean, what was we'll go back to Marcus. What were we thinking? This guy was homeless, right? Been thrown out by his family, couldn't find a way, was struggling with his sexuality, all this kind of stuff. And we were going to want to just go in there and take his opiates away? Who the fuck am I? Who the fuck are we? Anyway.
Yeah, we all need our things. Hey folks, it's sponsor time. The company is CV Sciences, the product is Plus CBD, and the discount code for 20% off is Lex Files. And remember, the top 3 reasons to use that code on pluscbdoil.com. Number 1, I would give Plus CBD to your grandmother because I gave it to my grandmother. Number 2, I was the biggest skeptic. Then I started studying the endocannabinoid system. Number 3, I know firsthand that CV Sciences is committed to pure science and to enhancing well-being. So when you find yourself in need of CBD from true agricultural hemp, consider Plus CBD, the number 1 CBD brand in the United States. That coupon code is Lex Files, and the place to use it is pluscbdoil.com. You're talking about the experience itself and then the importance of after the experience. And so in New York, you're doing disintegration ceremonies or work to let people process. Can you talk more about those?
Yeah, we have a weekly group, and now it's moved to Zoom, and it's kind of grown. The disintegration, why do we call it disintegration? Well, my colleague and friend, Brian Murphy, who's this, a psychotherapist, has been working, with folks before and after medicine for a couple decades now. And we've collaborated on many things, including working with active drug users at a place called New York Harm Reduction Educators in Harlem, where we do ceremony, and we could talk about that later. But the disintegration, Brian's like, let's do an integration group, and there was something in it that this whole integration thing fucking bugs me, and the reason it bugs me, and what we sort of came to as we discussed the group, is, well, I'll go to the Krishnamurti quote, and I'll probably fuck it up, but I'll get close. Being well adjusted to a sick society is no sign of health. So the idea of the goal of psychiatry and psychology and so-called mental health is to return people to baseline, which means the way everyone else is acting. And in our society, in a capitalist society, means two things. And the work, it means two things in service to making you a good worker and a good consumer. And that is the mark of, I guess, citizenship in this culture. And so baseline is, for instance, the day in the States, the day after Thanksgiving, which they call Black Friday, where everyone lines up in front of a store and they have sales and they stampede and literally injure each other every Friday after Thanksgiving. It's a tradition. Now, it's not pathologized. It's just sort of shown on all the news stations and all the media outlets as, this is what they do. This is what we do. So it's the idea, and it's the goal, stated or unstated, of mental health is also to make you a compliant worker and a compliant consumer. So what are we integrating into? That's my question when they talk about integration. What are we integrating into? And what we want to do, Brian in his work, he's got a website called After the Medicine, and he's highly recommend if you're thinking about psychedelics. He doesn't work with them, but he works with people before and after. Give Brian a call. But what Brian and I try to do is to allow folks more space to not be the perfect mom or the perfect consumer or the perfect worker or a better consumer. It's just a space to allow what we call spirit to unfold. And I'm not necessarily talking about visions or any of that. I'm talking about spirit, soul. Actually, it's two different things, but we won't go into that. So the idea is that this is a sick society. We don't want you to integrate. We want to disintegrate those chains that are on you. We also understand you got to go to work. We're not going to go live in a mud hut in Oaxaca, all of us. I have no desire to. There's no Wi-Fi from what I understand. But the idea is that to sort of recognize that oppression and have it, and it's not an overtly political group at all. You know, I don't bring much of, I mean, my politics inform my life, as my spirituality and my religion inform my life, but I don't bring it in there into the group. But it maybe is the subtext that we are damaged by the society, and what we need to do is acknowledge that and find ways in which we can expand our spirit, our soul, and disintegrate the oppressive apparatus that is the function of capitalism. That there's a structural violence. I mean, we're seeing it a lot. You know, it's right now. Clearly, the structural racism and the structural sexism and the structural homophobia and so forth. But this is a violent structure that is destroying the planet. And what I find particularly, and maybe this is an antidote, maybe the group's an antidote. First of all, it's a kind place with smart, kind people. That's the first thing. So I should say that we're able to explore these things. But the psychedelic movement, let me stop that. There's no revival or renaissance. It's just bullshit. People have been tripping all throughout. And if there is a revival, it's outside of the institutions. The institutions want to, the academy, the hospital wants to sort of dictate, you know, when it's the job to be the standard bearer of capital and of state, right? But this shit has been going on for years. Now there's an uptake in LSD. I just saw from some people are saying that there's a 8%, 20%, I don't know what it is, but a big uptake in the consumption of LSD since COVID. But it's folks doing it themselves. And that's what it is. That's what interests me. I'm more interested in for instance, my daughter and her friends and what they're doing. Like, young urban, kids of color, how they're using psychedelics to navigate this world. That interests me far more. I'm digressing a little bit. I'm going to get back. What really distresses me, though, and it doesn't distress me because it's par for the course, is psychedelics being used in service to these structures of violence. Why these young people, millennials, and the younger generation, what do they call them?
Gen Z, I think.
Yeah, I mean, when they call you Z, like, what is that telling you? If you're Z, like, if there's no other letter after you, so these kids know that the fucking time is up, right? But as they point to abolition and that of police and state violence, that is going to expand. It's going to expand to all systems of domination. The psychedelic movement, meaning the establishment movement of psychedelics, the so-called science psychedelics, and that's a whole other thing. I don't think it's science, but we could talk about that later. But it seeks to establish itself firmly in the pillars of social control. So you look at, they want to talk to religious leaders, to military, to cops, and to the academy, right? These are the places where they want to, try to do their studies, and also the people they want doing the studies on, right? And what it does is it legitimizes, not only do they legitimize themselves, they legitimize these violent structures. And that to me is because this is my little world, that to me gets my blood boiling. It's been the stated goal for it not to be a evolutionary movement. The idea is to place it firmly within these structures of violence, the structures of the hospital, the structures of the clinic, the structure of the military, the structure of the church, to put them in there to mitigate the harms that these structures produce. We're harmed because we're born human, and then we're born into our family and our culture, and then there's the societal harms. And I would argue that in this time of abolition, we need to not only abolish the police, and these young people are saying the same thing, thank God, it's like it's like so beautiful to hear, but also we need to abolish the clinic, We need to abolish the mental health facility. We need the abolition of the rehab and the abolition of the methadone clinic and the abolition of all these things, because this structure is not only leading to just oppression, but the destruction of organized life on Earth. So, where was I? So this is what sort of drives me nuts. Those systems are all being showed to be illegitimate, and the psychedelic movement is trying to legitimize itself because it's being run by a bunch of old motherfucking boomers, old white boomers. They don't get it. It's done, man. Put a fucking fork in it. It's done. And they want to distance themselves from those liberatory practices. Some of them crazy hippies, sure, Leary, but also the underground, the fact that the 10-point plan was written by the Black Panthers was written on acid. They want to move themselves away from the merry prankster, but they have never tried to move themselves away from the CIA roots, from the roots that came from actually Nazi Germany with experiments in Dachau with mescaline and the recruitment of those folks to the United States for the purposes of mind control. I mean, this is official record. You can go Google, not Google, but
Operation Paperclip.
The Operation Paperclip was not just about NASA. It was bringing all these folks over, and the brutal use of involuntary use on poor people, of psychedelics on poor people, on black people, on so-called mentally ill people, and on incarcerated people. They have gone to great lengths to say, we want to get back to the research. You hear them say it, right? That was part of the research. And the fact that they don't even acknowledge that and want to separate themselves from any liberatory, not those crazy hippies, this is who we are. So, my grandma always said, some people will tell you who they are, and that's who they are. And that's what they're seeking to do. And then to legitimize a dying so-called science of psychiatry and psychology. Is it a science, Lex?
That's above my pay grade. I'm just a biochemist where things are a little bit normal. It's so much easier to talk about.
As a biochemist, if you look at psychiatry and psychology, would you say it's a hard science?
No.
Thank you.
And it is the thing. The idea that as someone who uses psychedelics, the idea that the main gatekeepers for psychedelics would be psychiatrists is kind of terrifying. I mean, as Huxley said, the reason psychiatrists get into this game is because of their own dark icebergs. And, I know some great ones. Like, we both know Julie Holland. She's a great person to give
Ken
this.
Albert's my brother. I mean, these are my friends. Some of my best friends are psychiatrists.
Yeah, but when you meet them at the dinner parties and cocktail parties around New York or wherever you are in the country, I mean, by and large, they're some of the weirdest people you run into. And the idea that these are the only people that might be qualified to allow these potent substances out there is scary. That's why.
I mean, that's the sort of what is happening right now in the streets. But it's sort of the central. It's anarchism 101. That Noam Chomsky explains it so beautifully. As our elder anarchist in the States, he explains it so well. Basically, do you have the moral authority? Do you have the authority? Authority is not self-justifying. And so the entire psychedelic, and again, this idea of the establishment psychedelic, let's just say that, is based on we need to put this in proper hands, right? But you have to justify your authority. And if we look at psychiatry, the list of everything from women being hysterical because the pathologizing of strong women as hysterical, which went on, in my lifetime, to the diagnosis for runaway slaves, diagnosis not that many years ago, guys, if 30-something years ago, for gay people, and then the diagnosis now for oppositional defiance disorder, which means that if you're a young person and you think, you tell authority to go fuck themselves, that it's a fucking pathology. And the use of it, of all kinds of methods, from lobotomy to cold water enemas to throwing pills at every type of behavior, you look at that history, and that's a recent history, and also the 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 diversity of 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 diagnosis, um, even on the same person. There's been studies where they diagnose to say have five shrinks in the room. There's five different diagnoses, but often those diagnoses are based on race and class and gender and sexuality. So, a white woman in Scarsdale, New York, in a rich area in New York, might be a manic depressive, where like a black woman in the shelter might be a schizophrenic. And so all of this, what it says to me is it's not legitimate. And we also have to understand that they're not talking about freeing these drugs up. We're not talking about decriminalization here. We're talking about prescription, which is the opposite of decriminalization. It's prescribed for one group of people, which I would argue have not proven their authority. And what Chomsky says is the example he gives, which I think is great, is walking across the street with his 4-year-old granddaughter, and a car's coming. So she wants to walk in traffic. He grabs her hand and gives her a little tug back. I think we could all say that you have the authority to do that. You don't have the authority to beat that child, right? So we just need to look, he's the grandfather. Just because you're the grandfather, just because you're the shrink, you don't have the authority. We shouldn't. So I am very concerned about how these will use. And, the killing of Elijah McClain, the young black man who was beaten to death, but also given a shot of ketamine, should be, it's just one, and I would say it's just the latest, but it's not the latest, because that happened last year. And we know for sure that these practices continue. But why I'm speaking about this young man's death, this young man's murder by the hands of the state, is because he was different. He was black, number one. He was male, number two, yes. But he was, if he was, let's say, I don't know, an English gentleman or an artist in Soho, he'd be described as eccentric. He played the violin. I mean, it's heartbreaking to hear this young man's story. I cannot read his last words because it's just heartbreaking. He played the violin. He would go and play for cats at the animal shelter. And as he's being killed, and I wish we had his last words here, but I ask your readers to go read to find his last words. He's describing that he's different. He's saying, I'm a gentle Gemini, and I'm going to get his words wrong, and I apologize for that. I'm a vegetarian. I'm just different. I don't want to hurt anyone. You guys are doing a great job. Please don't hurt me. And it just goes on. And what he's explaining is, I'm different. Please don't hurt me. And then he's beaten and given ketamine, which has been put into this whole psychedelic category, to subdue and suppress him because he's viewed, for whatever reason, at that moment as a threat to the state. So his blackness, his black and maleness, and his difference is contributed greatly to why he died. The reason they pulled him over was that he was wearing, this was before COVID, he was wearing a what do you call it? A sort of a mask over his face, one of those hats that become a mask. And it was summer. And so that's why he was stopped. And he had some sort of condition that maybe or maybe not, that it seems that he was just, like I said, a different sort of young man. But he was killed partially with the use of a psychedelic by the state. And by the way, where the fuck are the psychiatrists and the organizations outrage over this? Where's the psychedelic community's outrage over this? So it's not the first time. It's not the last time. We know that they gave LSD to prisoners. They gave Whitey Bulger LSD something like every day for 180 days against his will. And then he became an informant for the FBI. We know that they gave Iboga to black inmates who were going to seek help without their knowledge, and they gave them heroin in prison. We know that they've slipped it into people's drinks. We know that they confine people and can take away your liberties based on a diagnosis which is arbitrary. And so this is probably the more brutal aspects of the way psychedelics not can be, not used to be, are being used. And I say they have no authority.
That brings me up to the last thing I wanted to talk to you about. Speaking of anarchism and of ways of doing it outside the state, because you were the one who actually introduced me to the 12-step programs, and getting me into those rooms was one of the most important things that ever happened to me. And one of the things about 12-step programs is, in general, they're seen as being against psychedelics and that not being part of a sober life. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that and how that has been and how that might be evolving.
Okay, sure. I'd like to, first of all, people might not understand the anarchy part of that. So let me take that piece first, okay? If you look at the 12 traditions of the 12-step fellowship, it is basically, I think, the most, well, not basic, I think it is the most revolutionary, amongst the most revolutionary writings that's ever come out of the States, including Thomas Paine, or it's certainly one of the most revolutionary documents, including the Black Panther 10-point program or the Port Huron document or whatever. The reason I say that is because it is, in those 11 traditions, it is a formula, an anarchic formula, and Bill W. studied, and read The Anarchist. He even said in the 1956 AA convention, "I am an anarchist in this fellowship." Basically, it's to break it down without going over every tradition, that no money from outside, rejecting money from outside. Nobody leads. There is no rules. If there are positions, they are rotating. You can hire professionals for accountants and stuff like that, but there's no leaders. There's no rulers. The only governance is a sort of a collective governance, sort of guided by a higher power, however it manifests. And you maintain anonymity at the level of press. And that's to say, I won't say exactly what fellowship I belong to, but that document, because it is a document that anticipates guruism, anticipates professionalism, anticipates gatekeepers, and the tendency for that to happen, allows for a self-governance that is remarkable. I should say that one of the flaws of the early 12-steppers is the same flaw that I see in the three things that are dear to my heart, which has helped me in my life, which is harm reduction, which saved my life, psychedelics, which saved my life, and 12 steps, is the desire to not just be affirmed by so-called science and by so-called medicine, Western medicine, but it goes to from trying to be affirmed and as a political means of moving a movement forward. Political, I mean in the broadest sense of the term. So the legitimacy that you get from the doctors, right? So in the 12 steps, they have the opinion of the doctors. They decided it was a disease, and by calling it a disease, I understand how it advanced the movement. But the biggest problem with it, and for those outside of 12 steps, for me, the biggest problem and the critique of 12 steps is that it's not a disease. And I agree. So in the same way that harm reduction, we had the science. We said if you give this syringe to somebody, chance of a clean syringe every week or every day, chances of HIV, hepatitis C infection go way, way down. That's how we got in. That's how we got funding. Right now, the psychedelic movement. This is, we need the science. We need the shrinks. And this is how it's moving forward with the so-called science. The problem is that structure will take over. Those institutions, those social, those institutions, the institution of medicine and science will take over because it is reductionist and then it's hierarchical. We place it higher. So you see harm reduction clinics, harm reduction spaces going from a place where folks can just come and hang out and, and there's sort of a free movement and a sort of an egalitarian feel to it, as was in the early days, to very institutionalized, and now we're checking the boxes and less human. The psychedelic movement, we see the same thing. It's becoming institutionalized, less and less human, less and less space, less and less time. And then you see what happened with with 12 steps is that aspect, the disease aspect, took over, completely consumed the movement. So then, part of this 12 steps is it was forever non-professional. But because they let the doctors in the door, then the doctors started running shit. And so then you got people being forced into 12 steps through court order, forced into treatment that has 12 steps as part of the treatment, when this should be a totally voluntary thing. So I just wanted to point that out. Why, so we'll get back to the psychedelics. First of all, Bill W., this great revolutionary thinker, was also, friends with Huxley, and, also, I don't know if you've ever read the correspondence with Huxley or Jung, they're fascinating. But Bill did acid because he was sort of that elite that was doing acid that, connected with the Luce family and all those folks. Incidentally, it all sort of still stems from that MK Ultra crowd, but that's another story. But he did acid and was a proponent for LSD. A lot of people don't know that. Tripped many times, and for many years, and he saw it as a treatment for alcohol addiction, as a potential treatment. He loved acid, but that kind of got submerged. And of course, when you talk about abstinence, and by the way, 12 steps is not just for alcohol or drugs. There's all kinds of programs for overeating, sex addiction, gambling, whatever, shopping, whatever. But the idea of sobriety as being, sort of focus. A drug is a drug is a drug. Well, that started getting tested in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, even more when folks started taking SSRIs, and some folks were being helped by that, and the 12-step community sort of had to expand. I remember going into meetings when I was still using in the 80s, and people were on SSRIs. They couldn't be sober. There's a concept in 12 steps called an outside issue, and they're not connected to any outside issue, right? So the issue is just your sobriety. I would say that that LSD psychedelics is one of those outside issues. What we're seeing today, what I've been noticing in my own recovery in the last 18 years, but particularly as a practitioner, I still work out of the country with MDMA and psilocybin and Iboga. I still am a practitioner. People are calling me and talking to me about psychedelics. Increasingly, people in recovery, those with there's people like me that came into recovery because I did Iboga, got clean, and then I went into 12 steps, which worked amazingly well together. But there are people with 5 years, 10 years, 20 years in recovery that are now being opened because that white guy wrote that book. The white guy did 5 drugs, God bless him. Now are being open to the fact that maybe I'm not relapsing if I want to address I haven't used in 10 years, 20 years because of 12 steps, but I'm still depressed. I'm still sad. I'm still anxious. Or I just want to deepen my recovery. Those calls have been increasing over the last few years. And about, I don't know, I guess it's about 7 years ago, myself and others formed a fellowship, which I can't name. But if you do some research, and maybe there'll be some kind of post in this, you guys can put whatever website you want up. But we formed a fellowship of folks who use psychedelics for their recovery. People who are either got into recovery, 12-step recovery through psychedelics, or people are interested in deepening their recovery with psychedelics. And it's actually grown, especially from COVID to now it's sort of international, and it's a growing fellowship. And what we're finding, well, what I've found and what I'm seeing now with hundreds of people from all over the world is they had the same experience I did, which was that the 12 steps in conjunction with a very thoughtful psychedelic therapeutic or religious or spiritual practice is unmatched. And so we got this fellowship, and and it's not just, these are people who are very serious. We check in, like, am I on the verge of doing, using this too much? It's a place to check in, to share, to not be judged. But I believe that more and more folks are going to be coming to that kind of recovery. It's just growing exponentially. And there is, this is for my own recovery. I can't say it for other folks. What I always use is the first step. I always say my life has become unmanageable. So I always look for unmanageability in myself and in whatever, food, whatever, sex, drugs, booze, whatever. If there's an unmanageable quality to that, then I know that that's the same thing as what we call addiction. So that's the first step. My life has become unmanageable. If this is helping with manageability in a very, and look, it's not everyone should do it. We tell folks who got 6 months off of something, that's not the time to do ayahuasca. Just chill. Like let it go. At least I do. People have different takes on it. But as long as it's not contributing to unmanageability, then it's not going into so-called addiction. And it's been helpful. Howard Lutzoff years ago, the guy who found Iboga and was my teacher and friend, said it's unparalleled, those combinations. So, what I would do, and I don't trip much, just a couple of times a year, even though it's my work, just a couple of times a year, I would finish some step work, finish a step, and then go do a journey. And just it solidifies it, deeps it. I mean, I'm on those meetings and I'm just hearing incredible stories of really thoughtful folks who are very serious about the sobriety and psychedelics.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing. I think that's actually a great spot to end on a note of hope in a dark world.
Yeah.
And Before I let you go, though, where could people find more of your work and your writing and all the stuff you've produced all these years?
So you can go to my website, dimitrimugianis.com. And I should just give a shout out to also work in Harlem here, in East Harlem, at a needle exchange and harm reduction. We do holistic work there. I just want to say that. We provide acupuncture, tai chi, qigong, meditation, sound baths, ritual for active drug users, for sex workers, for formerly incarcerated people, and for homeless people. So we're bringing the medicines that we all know work for us to people on the street. And the name of that place is New York Harm Reduction Educators. And yeah, so check me out on my website. Also, we do the psychedelic disintegration group every Tuesday at 7:00 Eastern Standard Time, New York time. And you can, join that on my website.
Well, great. It's a great organization to donate to anyone who wants to help out there right now. And I just want to say thanks for taking the time to talk to us. It was really great to hear from you.
I love you, Lex. I'm just really, whenever you want to talk, bro, I'm down.
Sounds awesome. I love you too, brother.
Awesome.
Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, find us at pluscbdoil.com/Lex Files. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com. If you enjoyed the program, please rate us on iTunes and share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. Our chief advisor is Amabel Dela Cruz. The music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. Our sponsor is CV Sciences, maker of America's favorite CBD oil. And remember the coupon code LEXFILES. I'm Lex Pelger, signing off.